In this video, I'll be showing you a technique for adding shading and details to crepe paper flowers. You will need the following supplies: paper plates, crepe paper petals, a cup of water, acrylic paint, and a paintbrush and a paper towel. So I'm starting with 2 plates here. The one on the right will be for my paint mixing and the one on the left will be where the petal will go. So I'm going to start by putting some acrylic paint on that plate, and then I'll just get some water on the plate also. The key to this whole technique is to dilute the paint, so you're not just using pure paint. Next, I'm going to just take that water and lightly coat the petal so everything is covered. And the lighter you go, the more intense the color will be, so it just kind of depends what look you're going for and what kind of flower you're making. So once I did that, I'm just mixing some of that yellow paint with some of the water, so it's pretty diluted at this point. It's always best to start with paint that's more diluted and then work up to adding more paint so it's a higher percentage of paint. You can always add paint, but you can't take it away. So right now I'm just creating a light wash of yellow around the top portion of this petal, kind of that circular area, and keeping it most concentrated towards the edges. And I always recommend looking at a picture of the flower that you're creating. That way you have an idea of where each color needs to go and how intense the color should be in the different areas. So now I'm coming in with another round of paint, and this time you can tell if the color is more intense. I'm using less water and more paint, and I'm just going to keep this towards the edges, and I know on my petal that the yellow will be the most intense right at the edges, so that is what I'm trying to duplicate here. It's a good idea to go in while you're doing this and kind of blend any hard edges just to make sure that the color transitions are very natural and look like a real petal would. So now I'm adding even more concentrated paint, again keeping this right towards the edge, trying to create an ombre effect from the center of the petal out to the edges. And now I'm coming in and just making things more blended. So I'm adding some yellow further down because I felt there needed to be more yellow overall on the petal. And now I'm going to take some water and just dilute that edge and blend that edge out so it's a smooth transition. Next, I'm going to take some light yellow acrylic paint. So I've moved from the medium yellow to the light yellow, and I'll be keeping this just right at the very edges of the petal. So I'm just going to dilute that a bit and then just put that around the edge. Then I'm going to just take some of that off onto the paper towel and come back in and blend it out more. Now I'm adding more right at that edge. So just adding it wherever it looks like it needs it. And then I took some of the paint off the brush using the plate and the paper towel, and I'm going to come in and just blend it more. So when you want to blend, you want to make sure that you have just a tiny bit of paint on the brush. And finally, I'm taking this dark pink color and I'll use it to add shading at the base of the petal. So it's basically the same process as the yellow was, except I'm adding it to the bottom, keeping it darkest right at the edge and blending it upwards. So now I'm mixing it with some water, taking some of the paint off onto the paper towel and coming in and just blending that out, again to make it look natural. So I'm happy with how this looks at this point. I think it looks like what I'm trying to recreate. So at this point, we need to take the petal off the plate, and I'm going to lay it on a piece of saran wrap outside so it will dry quickly and there's no risk of getting it on things. So just very carefully peel an edge of the petal off the plate and then lay it down onto the saran wrap. And then if it folds over on itself, if any paint gets where it shouldn't be, it's easy to blend out. Just use a wet paintbrush that doesn't have any paint on it. So now I'm moving on to the next petal just to kind of show you the process again, but in high speed this time. So basically it's just adding layers of paint, starting with layers that are very, very light that have very little paint in them at all and working up to layers that are much more concentrated. And the earlier layers typically cover more of the petal, and the later layers cover just the darker portions. So you're just kind of blending out through each layer. And of course, how you paint it will vary depending on what flower you're creating. So now I'm finished with that petal, and I just need to repeat that with the rest of them. So now they're all dry. It's the next day. I let them dry overnight. And this is the painted side, and this is the back side that didn't get painted. And as you can tell, it pretty much retained its original color. The paint doesn't really soak through, at least on this crepe paper. So I'm going to repeat pretty much the exact same process of wetting down the crepe paper, and then I'll just add the paint just like I did before, using layers that gradually work up to more concentrated paint. And that first side ended up drying a little bit lighter than I had intended the color to be on the petals, especially the yellow was a little less intense than I'd like it to be. So on this side, I'm going to go more intense with the paint. I'm going to keep it more concentrated. And I also started out by adding less water to the petal in the first place, because that does help make the paint less concentrated. So at this point, I'm still adding the medium yellow, and I'm going to blend out what I've added to this point. So I just took the paint off the brush mostly, and I'm just blending that out. And then I'll come back in with more concentrated paint once again, keeping it towards the edges. So because I wanted this petal to turn out much more intense than the others did, you can see at this point that I'm really not diluting the paint at all. But again, this is something you only want to do on your most intensely colored areas of the petal. And adding the paint like this that isn't diluted will change the texture of the crepe paper a bit. It will make it a little bit thicker and less pliable, so that's something to keep in mind. So now I'm just going to come in and blend all of that out. And finally adding that light yellow paint right to the very edges. And coming back in and blending that out. And finally, I'm adding the third color, which is that dark pink paint. Again, I'm keeping it most intense at the bottom of the petal and blending it upwards. And now just coming in and adding some last minute adjustments anywhere that I feel needed more color. And then blending that out. So there is the finished petal, and I'm going to go ahead and let that dry. So once all the petals got painted and I let them dry overnight, these were the finished results. So you can see that one side is definitely lighter than the other, but that's perfect because the underside of the petal needs to be lighter. I hope you found this technique for painting crepe paper flowers helpful. If you're interested in the hibiscus pattern that I showed in this video, it's now available in my Etsy shop. Thank you so much for watching, and I'd love to see the beautiful flowers you create.